Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. A bug bit me on the eyelid today, so please bear with me. We find ourselves in Franklin County, Pennsylvania today, which is just outside of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which you may be familiar with. This is a big area for history enthusiasts and Civil War buffs. In this small town lived the Snyders, Melvin and his wife Joanne. Melvin worked for a company called Grove Worldwide, which was a manufacturing company, and Joanne baked pies at a local diner in town. At 5:30 in the morning of Saturday, May 25th, 1985, Joanne left for work. She spent her Saturday, as usual, baking pies at the diner, and when her shift ended that day around noon, she made her way home. As she pulled up into the driveway, she noticed her husband Melvin's truck was gone. This was odd. She walked around the property, looking in the barn and around the house, but couldn't find Melvin anywhere. He hadn't told her that he was going anywhere that day, and Joanne had expected to see him when she got home from work. After looking around some more outside, she noticed some things that were a little off. As she was looking around the yard and the barn, she found several of Melvin's tools to have been left outside. This was very unlike Melvin, as he was a very neat and very meticulous person, and was the type that everything has its own place, and when you're done using it, you put it back. So for Joanne to find his tools scattered all over the place, this was enough to make her nervous. After looking around by herself for a while, Joanne then called some family members who lived nearby to help her search. While looking in the couple's barn, someone found a shell casing for a .25 caliber bullet on the floor, buried beneath some hay. After sifting more through the hay, no blood was found. In fact, nothing more than that single .25 caliber shell casing was found. It was later noted that a bullet like a .25 caliber will not usually travel through the human body because of its size and the speed in which it leaves the gun. Typically, the smaller the bullet and the faster it travels, the less damage it causes. During the Civil War, shots fired from something like a rifled musket, which would have been something like a .58 caliber, moved a lot slower through the air and would cause a lot more damage upon impact. I've been to Gettysburg, can you tell? Because of this, that is most likely why no blood was found in the hay or anywhere else in the barn. 2 days later, Joanne filed a missing persons report for Melvin. That same day, police actually found Melvin's truck more than 60 miles away in a grocery store parking lot in Maryland. As they found the truck, the windows were rolled halfway down and the keys were still in the ignition. When they investigated inside the truck, they found Melvin's wallet, checkbook, and his .22 caliber rifle. Because these items were sitting in plain view, they figured that no robbery had occurred. In the bed of the truck, police did find some unusual markings, but other than that, they saw nothing pointing to anything sinister. When they turned the truck on, they discovered that the radio had been programmed to a rock music station, which was odd because apparently Melvin never listened to rock music. This would indicate that someone else was in the truck last and possibly had driven it. The truck had been wiped clean and not even Melvin's fingerprints were found. Joanne had also told police that some of Melvin's clothing was missing, including a jacket, 3 pairs of shoes, several pairs of underwear, a Western-style shirt, and 10 handkerchiefs. The Snyders' friends and family said that the couple had a good relationship and they never saw anything concerning from the outside looking in. But it had been revealed a year earlier, Melvin began having an affair with a woman named Teresa Harshman, who was married to one of Melvin's coworkers named Ron. He had met Teresa at square dancing. Melvin and Teresa actually ended up running off together to Montana, quitting their jobs, and leaving their families behind. It was during this time that Melvin's wife Joanne and Teresa's husband Ron began a relationship of their own. Both of their spouses had left, so one could say that they had a lot in common. They began seeing each other frequently and had gone on several dates. However, just 3 weeks later, Melvin and Teresa had left Montana, feeling as though they had made a mistake, and returned home to Pennsylvania and reunited with their respective partners. Both couples appeared to continue with their marriages, business as usual, and all appeared to be forgiven and okay. After police had heard about this brief affair, they were interested in speaking with both Teresa and Ron, since both of them seemingly would have potentially had motive for Melvin's disappearance. Ron, of course, might have been holding a grudge about Melvin running off with his wife, and Teresa might have been a scorned lover. I'm not sure who left who and who decided to end the affair. But after speaking with them, neither Ron nor Teresa had any knowledge of Melvin's whereabouts. Since Melvin had run off in the past, police and his wife Joanne wouldn't have put it past him to have run off again. Police had checked Melvin's bank records, but there had been no activity on his credit cards. How long would he be able to make it on cash alone? Probably not that long. He may not have been the most faithful husband, but he was a devoted father to his young son. His family was concerned about the state his truck was found in, where the windows were rolled down and the key in the ignition. They thought, could this have been a setup? Was he forced out of the truck? Police were beginning to suspect foul play. His family didn't know of any reason as to why he would leave home and not return. They were sure he wasn't engaged in another affair like last time. It was well known, and there was obvious credit card usage. I mean, he left a paper trail. He wasn't trying to hide anything, really. This time, not a trace. Investigators had divers check the lakes and ponds in the area, and they spoke with the Snyder's neighbors and asked if they recalled anything suspicious in the days leading up to Melvin's disappearance. No one saw him leave, and no one recalled anything out of the ordinary. He seemingly just vanished. The only thing police had to go on was an off comment one of the neighbors made. He said he remembered seeing a dark-colored, possibly brown, truck near the Snyder's home on the day Melvin disappeared. It was similar to the type of truck that Ron Harshman owned. After more time had passed, with no leads, investigators began cross-referencing his dental records with every single unidentified body that was found in the United States, but didn't find a match. This is somewhat encouraging since we have no reason to believe that he is not alive. His history of running off, believe it or not, gave his family hope. Because investigators' only lead at this point was a truck that was similar to the one Ron owned, they began focusing their efforts on him. They had discovered that just a few weeks before Melvin's disappearance, Ron had purchased a .25 caliber handgun, which, as you remember, was the same caliber as the casing found in the Snyder's barn. During a search of Ron's home, police uncovered a box of .25 caliber bullets, but no gun. Police then asked Ron where the gun was, and Ron said, "You'll have to ask Teresa. She's the one who took the gun." Interesting. Police then asked Teresa about this, and she flat out said, "That's a lie. I don't even like guns." She said she didn't even know anything about this gun. She had no idea that Ron had even bought it. Police then learned about a confrontation between Melvin and Ron just after Ron had discovered that Melvin and Teresa were having an affair. Ron had learned that Melvin was coming to his home to pick up Teresa, and Ron went out, grabbed his rifle, got in his truck, and crashed his truck into Melvin. He then got out of his truck with his gun and shot at him twice, missing him both times, possibly on purpose. More likely, this was to send a message. At this point, Melvin was like, "I don't want to continue this. I don't even want to press charges." He was just done with it. He just wanted to let it go. Melvin was pretty embarrassed about this whole ordeal and knew how people around town talk, and deep down knew Ron's reaction was triggered by his own doing, although this is an extreme reaction that is not to be condoned. So obviously, everybody knew about the affair. Once Melvin and Teresa had come back from Montana, it seemed like they were able to get back with their partners and resume their relationships. Melvin and Joanne had apparently come to some sort of agreement, and as a couple were able to move past the incident. Ron and Teresa, however, were not. Ron was still holding on to some obvious animosity. Melvin was trying very hard to make amends and make his marriage with Joanne work, if not for each other, for their son. Ron and Teresa were not as smooth sailing. They really tried to patch things up between them, but as you can imagine, their relationship was never the same after that. They did end up separating the following year, and Teresa eventually filed for divorce. If you recall, while Melvin and Teresa were engaged in their tryst in Montana, Joanne and Ron were having a tryst of their own. As adamant as Joanne was about having no involvement in her husband Melvin's disappearance, she did admit to having had several phone conversations with Ron the week before Melvin disappeared. When asked about the nature of these phone calls, Both Joanne and Ron insisted they were innocent, and they didn't speak about Melvin at all. It is unclear if they were continuing on with their relationship, just on a smaller scale, or they were just friends who had shared this connection because of what had previously happened. Having nothing more to go on, the case stalled. The following year, Teresa and Ron's divorce was finalized. They sold their home and property and moved out of the area, going their separate ways. Ron continued to maintain his innocence throughout the years, and at one point demanded a meeting with police to put an end to their harassment. His words, during their meeting, it was said that although Ron was very sociable, he bordered on being angry. He wanted investigators to leave him alone and stop talking to his family, friends, and coworkers. And the investigators explained that, look, we're just doing our jobs, and this could all be put to rest if he would just take a polygraph test, and upon passing, they would personally apologize to everyone. But this was not something Ron was willing to do. He refused to take the polygraph test, even if he knew this would potentially clear his name and put an end to their harassment. I don't know why Ron wouldn't take the test unless he had something to hide. The police didn't have a body, they didn't have a murder weapon, and as far as we know, Melvin ran off again. Because of his past with Melvin, this made Ron an obvious suspect. Why he wouldn't try and clear himself is beyond me. Police believe that because of his past history, he was the only person who may have wanted to harm Melvin. Ron is the only person of interest here. However, that's just motive. There's no physical evidence or proof. Just before Melvin's disappearance, Melvin had told friends that he was afraid of Ron because Ron was still angry with him about his affair with Teresa. Although it seemed that everyone at the time had moved past it, he still had a feeling that Ron was never over it and had still harbored resentment against him. In the back of his mind, he always felt like something might happen. Because there was no body or weapon found, the case failed to make any progress or move forward for the next 15 years. The prosecutor on the case was having a hard time moving past this lack of advancement. He knew Melvin personally, and he knew something wasn't adding up. He felt that the missing .25 caliber gun was the key to the case. After all, finding the spent .25 caliber casing in the barn was troubling, and even more troubling, Ron had purchased a .25 caliber gun a little too close to Melvin's disappearance that he had misplaced. Without having physical possession of the gun, the prosecutor found the next best thing. While sifting through case files, he came across a note made from Ron that said that after he had purchased the gun, he had test fired it several times in his backyard. He thought that if he could find a shell casing fired from Ron's gun, he'd be able to compare it to the one they found in the Snyder's barn, and it could go one of two ways. It would either have completely different markings. As you know, every gun barrel has characteristics specific to the gun, such as divots or scratches, or it would be a match, and this would point to Ron. All he had to do was go out to the property and find this casing. Mind you, 15 years had passed, and the area was significantly overgrown. I don't want to say it's going to be like finding a needle in a haystack, but police were able to get the help of a local man named Donald Hinks, who owned a store that sold and serviced metal detecting equipment. Donald would regularly go out and find military artifacts like bullets from the Civil War and the French and Indian War. Donald and several of his friends got their metal detectors and headed out to Ron's old property, which was several hundred acres, and got to work. This endeavor wasn't easy. With all the farm equipment and the trash built up from so many years, they got many false pings. Donald had found several shell casings, but none of them were a .25 caliber. Donald then picked up a signal near an old clothesline post, and 20 minutes later, he scooped out a little dirt with his shovel, and right there was a .25 caliber shell casing. Wow. He could tell by the patina on the casing that this wasn't a freshly fired shot. This had been buried in the dirt for some time. When Donald had brought the shell casing to investigators, it was discovered that in addition to it being the same caliber, it was made by the same manufacturer as the shell casing found in the barn. They were hopeful that it could still hold up to testing all these years later. The ballistic expert at the Pennsylvania State Crime Lab compared the two casings, and after seeing the corrosion on the one that Donald had brought in, he said, "Don't get your hopes up. After all this time buried, it may be difficult to see the identifying characteristics. But when viewed and analyzed under the microscope, it had been determined that both casings were fired from the same gun." Based on the ballistic evidence, prosecutors charged Ron Harshman with first-degree murder. The date in which Melvin disappeared was exactly 1 year to the day when Melvin and Teresa began their affair. Police believe from this point, Ron was set on getting revenge. Why else would a shell casing from Ron's gun be found on Melvin's property? The evidence suggests that Ron drove his brown truck, the one the neighbor remembers seeing, to Melvin's home and found him in the barn. He then pointed his .25 caliber gun at him and pulled the trigger. Based on the scene, it is probable that the bullet itself did not exit Melvin's body. Ron then fled the barn, returning several hours later on his motorcycle. It is believed he somehow disposed of Melvin's body, then loaded his motorcycle in the back of Melvin's truck, causing the damage that police later saw, then drove to Maryland to abandon the truck in the grocery store parking lot, then returning back to Pennsylvania on his motorcycle. During a police interview, Joanne did admit that during one of her phone conversations with Ron, she revealed that Melvin would be home alone that day, but there is no evidence to suggest that Joanne had anything to do with Melvin's murder. Some people do believe that Joanne was in some way involved, but she just may have inadvertently given Ron this information, not expecting him to do anything. It could have been something as simple as she just made this passing comment that Melvin would be home alone that day. In 1990, Joanne was able to obtain a divorce from Melvin and later remarried. In 1993, she had Melvin declared legally dead. With no body found after all these years, it is clear that if this was a murder, it was meticulously planned out. Whoever did this wanted to ensure that he would never be found. During his trial, Ron had pled not guilty. Prosecutors knew that getting a conviction without a body would be extremely difficult. Although they didn't have the murder weapon, they did have the shell casing matching the suspected bullet used to kill Melvin, which was determined as being fired from the gun belonging to Ron Harshman. In July of 2001, Ron Harshman was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. While in prison, several inmates had claimed that Ron had confessed to them that he had killed Melvin, but their stories varied. He may have confessed to them, or they were just trying to exchange information for an earlier release. Regardless, he had never confessed to law enforcement. In 2017, Ron had filed for relief from his conviction. A federal magistrate judge had previously recommended in 2016 that he be set free. The district judge agreed, and with this recommendation, granted Ron's request. But during a 2019 meeting with the parole board, the Pennsylvania Board of Probation and Parole had denied Ron's request for parole. On July 29, 2019, Ron took a plea deal in connection with Melvin's murder and pled no contest, meaning he does not admit guilt, but acknowledges the prosecution has evidence against him. As far as I was able to find, it appears Ron is still waiting for his retrial. Following the no contest plea, the judge sentenced Ron to 10 to 20 years in prison, but he received credit for the time he had already served, which at the time was 19 years. Although Ron was convicted in Melvin's death, because Melvin's body was never found, he is still considered missing, despite Joanne having him declared legally dead. We may never know what happened in the barn that day. What do you think? Do you think there was enough proof to convict and sentence Ron? Do you think that Melvin left on his own? I feel like this case borders on open-ended, and there's always hope. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.